Okay, let's see here. Yep, I guess we have begun. Hey, everybody, welcome. It's me, Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com here on the Wisdom app. Basically, what I want to do in this talk is talk about front-end web development, like where it's been, what it is, where it's going, because it's become such a really, really interesting space. It just covers so much ground. So what is front-end web development to begin with? What is this whole concept of front and back? Basically, think of the front end of web development as really any code that runs in your browser. So when I open up a website, just some code that my Google Chrome browser downloads and runs and makes a visual and allows me to click buttons and things like that. That is my front end code. And its primary role is to essentially manufacture the user experience in the same way that if you go to a restaurant, the waiter, the decor, the table, the whole ambiance, all of that is what sort of is tailored to create an experience. Now, back-end development is all the code that happens outside of your browser. So all the stuff that happens before any code kind of gets downloaded by Chrome. So some server somewhere. And again, going back to that whole restaurant analogy, that's essentially the kitchen in the restaurant. Okay, so when I go to a restaurant, I experience the front end. I sit down at the table, I give my order to the waiter, but that request for a meal has to get delivered to the back end kitchen where the chefs, aka our server, prepares what I want and then sends it back. Okay, but again, my interaction as the person at the restaurant is always with sort of the front end. Same thing with web development. Every user is essentially using an app where they're interacting with the front end and back end vicariously, but they only really see that front end. They only see that visual, that experience. Okay, and front end engineers are going to be focused more on constructing that front end experience, while the back end is really sort of like the chefs in the kitchen designing the menu and saying, okay, hey, if the user asks for this, we got to prepare this. If the user asks for that, we got to prepare this. And that's essentially the distinction between front end and back end development. Now, in the earliest stages of the internet, really you just had one technology to really build that sort of front end experience. You had HTML, the hypertext markup language, okay? And it did everything. So if you wanted to change the colors of something, you had to do it in your HTML. You wanted to make something bold, you had to do it in your HTML. And basically every page had to be handcrafted. So if you were working as a web developer in the 90s, okay, like you added a new page to your website, you would have to hand make that website. And the tools for doing a lot of that wasn't necessarily as sophisticated as the tools we have today. I definitely remember being in middle school doing like basic HTML pages on GeoCities and kind of like the tediousness of creating like a page with a website with many pages. Okay, so you would oftentimes just would avoid having more pages than necessary. Cool. So then eventually other technologies get introduced. So I think it was in, well, basically I think it's like 1994, 1996, like CSS and JavaScript get introduced, respectively. And CSS allows us to sit there and designate like what color things are, where they're located on a page, all these sort of visual things outside of our HTML. So that way our HTML can just focus on sort of like designating the structure of the content of the page, saying, creating sort of a hierarchy of content. And then we can use our CSS to kind of discuss the visual of that hierarchy of content, and then use our JavaScript to create interactivity of that content. And then that was pretty much the extent of it. Okay, you basically just had web servers that would just serve an HTML document on response to an HTTP request. And then basically once you downloaded that HTML document, things like script tags or link tags that refer to a CSS or JavaScript file would then go pull those files. But eventually people started doing more and more server-side stuff with things like CGI scripts, Perl scripts, PHP, and you started having things that happened sort of off the server. One of the bigger ones was like PHP. I mean, PHP is still like 70, 80% of the internet, where basically PHP is still very unique in the way it works, where it's a language that renders on the server, but you don't have to build an application to do server-side rendering. You can create a PHP file and sort of mix in HTML, and PHP will just automatically sort of process that file run any code and templating all in one, and that's still sort of very awesome. Okay, so like there's a reason why PHP is still as big as it is, even though you always constantly hear people talk about like yay Node, yay Ruby, yay Python. They're the biggest thing when they're still just a fraction of the web. Okay, but basically you have PHP, and you start building out these websites. Like if you've ever seen WordPress, essentially what's happening is that you have what's called server-side templating, where I'm no longer building HTML files, I'm building like PHP files, but this also applies to several other languages and other ways of setting up templates, and you're creating like these sort of like Mad Libs. Okay, so remember Mad Libs where you'd have like a paragraph and there'd be certain like holes in the paragraph that you'd fill in with, whatever you decide to fill in that day with? Well, that's how the web worked. What would happen is that like you'd go to a user's page, but it was really just one file. And then basically all the user data were little like placeholders in the PHP file. And then when I went to my user page, the server would sit there, fill in those spots with my data, and then I would get the finished HTML file. And that is still how a lot of things are done. Okay, people still use WordPress in the same old WordPress way, which is very heavily reliant on that. Okay, but that still doesn't, the limitation of server-side templating is that you can't really designate like the interactivity of the website. So like if you wanted like something to move on the web page, or you don't want to have to send them to another page to create some sort of interaction. Well, in that case, you have to use JavaScript. And the problem with JavaScript, and especially like in the early 2000s, was it wasn't standardized. I mean, you started having like the ECMAScript committee who would standardize, but it's still like Microsoft kind of went and did a lot of its own things, which a lot of those innovations were good, but they still were kind of doing their own thing with their version of JavaScript. And then you had, different versions, different JavaScript engines. So the problem was, as a JavaScript developer, you would have to like develop your code and have to factor in, okay, I gotta do it this way for this browser and this way for that browser, because all the browsers didn't want things to sort of be compatible because they were trying to create market share, because like it was a business model to have a browser. Now, not as much so. Like you build a browser and I guess you make money off like search revenue, I guess, from the homepage. I'm not quite sure how you make money off a browser nowadays. But essentially you had this big browser war. And this is where like jQuery came in. Okay, jQuery made it where essentially you don't have to worry about compatibility. It just worked because basically the people who made jQuery made sure that everything kind of factored in the compatibility for all the browsers. And this is why jQuery still is pretty much the biggest JavaScript front-end framework that ever existed, and still used quite heavily. I mean, you'll hear people talk about like jQuery as a thing of yesterday, but as you'll see later on, there's like a very prominent use case for it, particularly when you're doing server-side templating. So if I'm building a website with PHP or some other templating language, like great, I can generate the pages dynamically from the server, but I still need to do all these front-end interactions. And then that's where jQuery comes in, where I can sprinkle a little bit of that JavaScript magic very easily. Okay, since then, JavaScript has evolved, and the ability to just do that in plain JavaScript has become a lot easier. So nowadays, I could just do it in JavaScript, but JavaScript has jQuery definitely has some niceties. One, its syntax is just like super easy to pick up and super easy to learn. It has like a lot of helper functions that make certain like very typical tasks still very easy. Not necessarily like, it's not quite as a big difference as it once was, like in the early 2000s, but still a very great thing to use in certain contexts. But then what happened is over time, people wanted to move away from server-side rendering, from like letting templates render the pages. Now, why would you want to get away from that? Well, let's think about it. If I go to a website, and then every time I go to every page, some server somewhere in the world has to rebuild that page, and if I hit refresh, I got to rebuild it again. I'm not assuming that like my browser's cached it or anything like that. That can be really taxing for the server, especially for pages that don't necessarily need constant re-rendering, where data doesn't change very often. Okay, but back in those days, like being able to create the sort of differentials, which we'll get to sort of like nowadays, we can actually be sort of like designate which pages are rendered every request versus at other time intervals. Things have kind of grown quite a bit. But back in those days, like that could really add up. Okay, and it could really slow down the user experience because they have to wait for each page to load. Okay, so then people started moving towards shifting a lot more of how the page gets built and rendered over to the front end. They said, okay, let's let the browser do more of the work. Two, my server doesn't have to do as much work. And then two, you know what, we'll let the user's computer do more of the work. So essentially what happened is that you would construct more of the website and a lot of the more of the changes in the website, instead of going from page to page, you would have one page that just changes using JavaScript. And this was done in the early days with like AngularJS, Backbone, Ember. Things like Ember and Angular are still around, except Angular went from AngularJS to Angular 2, and now I think it's like Angular 13. And it's now a very different framework than it was when it was AngularJS. Ember is still around. Ember is actually one of the few frameworks I haven't really spent that much time with, so I can't speak too much of it, but it has its audience. It's still around. I don't think Backbone is really all around that much, other than like just like legacy applications. But those were sort of like those like early stage ideas where it's just kind of like, and then Angular was sort of like the dominant framework at this period of time. Like Angular became sort of the new hotness. Okay, everyone was using Angular, but then Angular made a very interesting mistake. What happened is that Facebook comes out with React, which is another framework in this space of just saying, hey, how about this? Instead of having many pages, we'll just have one page and we'll let the JavaScript do all the work. But React kind of took a very different flair on it than Angular did. So Google kind of redid Angular to kind of adopt some of those ideas, but also to embrace newer technologies like TypeScript that would allow more discipline in your code, especially, which is great for like enterprise that really, wants to make sure that there's no bugs at runtime. So having things like TypeScript really helped make sure that you catch bugs earlier and quicker. Now, if anyone who's used TypeScript, it can be kind of tedious because you have to kind of like, basically the JavaScript, you don't type. You don't have to sit there and say like this variable is a number, or this variable is letters or something. TypeScript adds typing. Basically, you have to now designate that every variable is this, that variable is that, and that gets a little tedious, and sometimes it gets a little trickier than you'd expect. But it still helps prevent bugs because now you have errors that happen before you actually deliver the code to the public, and that's why people really like that. But the problem is when you made that shift, when Angular made the shift to using TypeScript and just basically building a whole new framework, it made all the old Angular code it wasn't backwards compatible. So basically everyone who had an Angular website was like, okay, well, I have a couple choices. I could either like just keep using the old version of Angular, but then that's not gonna be supported forever. I think maybe this year they finally stopped supporting it. Is either this year or still maybe another year. I know they gave it I think it was supposed to be 2020 they stopped supporting it, but because of COVID they extended it. So I think actually now in 2021 they may have finally stopped supporting AngularJS. I'll see if I can look that up while I do this talk. But yeah, so basically that's kind of what led a lot of people to switch over to React. Because they're like, if I'm going to have to rebuild my website anyways, let me go try the new hotness, which was React. And so people started using React, and React has, in the early days it was a little bit harder to use because you had classes and you had to worry about things like the this keyword and having the bind functions and having to define your statement with constructors, a lot of these things that just kind of made it a little bit more complicated than it is now. But then later on, they introduced the ability to do all that in functions, which just made like the syntax for React so much more simpler and intuitive, and it's just such a pleasant framework to work with, especially with this idea of JSX, where you basically had this kind of interesting combination of writing HTML that acted as JavaScript. That seems like a weird thing at first, but once you start doing it and you really start getting into like how it works, it just really it's just like a super high-powered writing of HTML, even though technically you're writing JavaScript. Okay, JSX, JavaScript XML, which is what they called it. And that's essentially still the main word today. Those are essentially still the two main frameworks that people use today, Angular and React. But there were several other entrants that are definitely worth noting. Sort of in third place, you have Vue. So Vue is made by Evan You, who was actually, I think, part of Google. I'm not sure if he was part of the original Angular team. I have a feeling he was. But it took a lot of the ideas from the original version of Angular and brought them back. And a lot of them were really cool ideas, things I still very much like. And created this framework that was like really easy to use. Like it just took a lot of things that were a little tricky in that older Angular and just really, really simplified them. Like just really, really easy to learn. It's gotten a little bit more complicated since then, but it's still like an easy thing you can pick up. You can easily just like add a little bit of view to a page. So if you don't want to like do a full switch to view, you could sprinkle it in like a jQuery in the same way you could sprinkle in jQuery. So it became really popular for a lot of people who wanted to use server-side templating as a way to kind of have more modern features, kind of like a React or an Angular, but be able to sprinkle it in to sites that are heavily done through templating. Because there's still a lot of people who like using templating, and again, I will definitely get back to that. Now, so that's all fun and good. Then there's Svelte, and then Svelte works a lot like Vue. So far as like the syntax goes, it's a lot like Vue, but even simpler. Like this learning Svelte is basically like, do you know HTML and JavaScript? Then you know Svelte. It's pretty amazing in how like little you really have to learn to be effective with Svelte. But that's not even the best part of Svelte. The best part is basically what it does is that it's a compiler. Now why is that important? It's because when you use React, Angular, and Vue, as a library, what happens is you have to ship React, you have to ship Angular, you have to ship Vue with your code. So not only are you shipping the code for your website, but you're shipping all the code from React and all the code from Vue, or parts of the code from Angular. Angular is a little bit more modular. But you ship all this code, and that makes your bundle, which is like the initial thing that the user has to download, bigger. Because again, the single page application world, instead of downloading one page at a time and you're just waiting for each page to get built one at a time, you're downloading the whole thing up front. You're downloading this whole application up front. The benefit is it takes a little longer to load on the initial download, but then going forward, you move really quickly because there is no having to download anything else. Everything's been downloaded per se because you've downloaded the application. And that's what makes like things like React, Angular, and Vue so fast and such a better user experience. With some costs though. But Svelte speeds that up quite a bit. And then the most recent entrant, Solid.js, basically takes the syntax of React, because everyone's kind of used to using React right now anyways, and then applies that same idea of compiling it. Okay, so it takes a lot of the ideas from Svelte and a lot of the ideas from React, even though I think it technically was based, it's more heavily inspired from another library that I never used called Knockout, but it borrows a lot from those ideas of like compiling and using JSX and things like this, and creates a syntax that's really easy to switch to if you're using React, but can actually be faster than Svelte, because the way you use a React syntax, or that React-ish syntax, and some of its unique hooks that are unique to Solid.js, it allows it to create more optimized code. So you're still compiling away the framework, so you're not shipping the framework in the final product, but you're able to sort of optimize a little bit more because you have a little bit more granularity on how you can define certain relationships to data and responsiveness and things like that. So that's really exciting, but it doesn't necessarily mean, it's the fastest, but all of them are fast. And for most people, they probably wouldn't notice the speed difference until it does matter. And then with React, there is just this huge ecosystem, and that's the thing about like the reward for sort of being a incumbent. So you have this huge ecosystem of people who have written tutorials, of people who've written libraries, so many libraries to help you in React. So in that case, even though maybe React may no longer be the fastest library, there's always the tools that you need somewhere. There's so many different state management libraries, so many different, and then you have other frameworks built on top of React. And this kind of gets us to like sort of, again, the next stage in sort of modern development, which is now we're moving away from saying, hey, you know what, let's just have the whole website rendered in the browser. But the problem with that is search engine optimization. The problem is like, technically my HTML file is empty now, and everything's being generated dynamically by JavaScript. And that hurts search engines' ability to kind of see like what's on my web page, what's going on. So that became a problem. So how do you like tie this knot and say, okay, how can I keep this fast, but also make sure I address search engine optimization? And you enter this whole new idea of static rendering, and which is kind of like an old idea because back in the day when you just crafted manual HTML files, that was just essentially static files. But the difference is that instead of you handcrafting every file, you have these generators, the original one being Jekyll, which is sort of what you use when you use GitHub Pages. It's essentially what they do is they can craft an HTML page dynamically for you. And you could have templates and whatnot, but instead of crafting the page on every request, so if I go to xyz.com, a server somewhere crafts an HTML page and sends it back to me, you're pre-generating all these files and then just serving the end result afterwards, which is a lot faster. It's actually probably the fastest thing you could do. And so that becomes this sort of new trend. And you start having like these static site generators being built on top of these frameworks. So you have like Scully for Angular, you have Nux for Vue, you have SvelteKit, Elder.js, Jungle.js for Svelte, you have Gatsby for React. And what they do is, again, they render a sort of a static page. And then there was this other framework, Next, that focused on doing server-side rendering with React. Again, going back to that whole idea of like, hey, let's render some of this stuff on the server. But then Next kind of grew, and this is why like Next has become so like interesting. Next now allows you to do static server-side and client rendering. So depending on how you write your code, certain code is going to get rendered right from the get-go because there's nothing's ever going to change. So just render it up front, so that way it's fast and fast. Then there's server-side rendering for pages that do have constantly changing data. And then you have client-side rendering when you have things that need to be interactive on the front end. So you can do it all now from one framework. You don't no longer have to choose, like, am I going to do this all on the server? Am I going to do this all on the client side? Or you don't have to, like, smush different frameworks together. I don't have to do, like, server-side templating and then use something like jQuery or sprinkle in a little Vue. Or nowadays, a very popular alternative is HTMX and Alpine, which are really cool, by the way. And that's another topic I want to talk about. But this becomes really interesting. I can do all the things, and I can sprinkle them on my page depending on sort of what that page's needs are. So, if a page on my site could be super blazing fast, it will be, and the ones that maybe need a little bit more work or need to do a little bit more work can do more work. And there's a bunch of other things that Vercel has done to kind of really sort of optimize all this, along with just their own infrastructure to sort of optimize the ability to do server-side rendering if you need to. So again, everything kind of comes back full circle. And the benefit of server-side rendering in this case is that if the HTML page is generated before it gets to the browser, then a search engine can then see the text on the HTML page and better sort of queue it up for people to find it. So again, having as much text as possible on that page before it hits the browser is going to maximize your search results. And then you can kind of leave the client-side rendering to like the buttons or maybe, if you're doing like a trivia game, just many little things that do need to change. So that is really, really, really powerful. And again, Nux for Vue can do the same thing, except GridSub is more like the Gatsby for Vue. Nux is more like the Next for Vue. Angular, I think there's something called Angular Universal that kind of ties that all together. Angular is a little bit more of a weird thing that I don't fully understand how it matches the same functionality. Svelte has SvelteKit, which acts as sort of all of the above, but particularly like SvelteKit, think of that as more like the Next.js for the Svelte world, which some of its own really, really cool features. So you have some really exciting stuff. And then even then at Svelte, there's another framework called Elder.js that's made by other people. I saw a really good interview with the creator that is really just geared towards search engine optimization. It's just like that's its focus. Because that's what the creator does. He creates pages that need to be very optimized for search engines and created a whole framework around it. So really, really interesting technologies, but that's all JavaScript. And that's the thing, not everyone wants to write JavaScript. Okay, so Next and Nux and SvelteKit are great if you love JavaScript. And I'm one of those people who love JavaScript. I could write JavaScript all day. But there's a lot of people who, they build their back end with Python. Let's say using like Django or Masonite or Flask. and they use Jinja for templating, okay? And they're like, well, I don't want to have to go now learn JavaScript too, or I don't really want to write JavaScript. I like writing Python, and I write Jinja to create those HTML pages, and I'm good with that. Okay, why do I need to go learn JavaScript? Traditionally, what they would do is they would learn jQuery, so that way they would write some minimal JavaScript for some front-end interactivity. But now you actually have these frameworks, HTMX and Alpine, that really kind of change up the thinking. Like what they do is they make it where it's a lot easier to essentially write sort of minimal interactivity, like again, sprinkle in some JavaScript magic, but without even writing JavaScript. Like if you're using Alpine, almost everything you need to write gets written as sort of like HTML attributes. And so basically, again, the amount of JavaScript you write gets really, really reduced. You're not even touching the same amount as you would with jQuery. And if using HTMX, you don't necessarily need a JSON API. Instead, you could actually have server-rendered snippets of a website, and you can swap them out on your page. So you could actually have the benefits of server rendering chunks of your website and swap them out instead of having to take them to a whole new page. And that's just like really cool. Although Next.js with React server components is kind of applying that in there. So technically now you even have that. Like Next is just kind of has all the things. It's like this souped up thing. It's very exciting. But again, for those developers who are like doing Ruby on Rails and they don't want to do, they want to write their ERB templates, but don't want to have to go like play and figure out React. Or JavaScript. They also have like their own version of things like Hotwire and I think like Sentry is the thing that gets paired with Hotwire. That's I think about to be released or is being worked on. But it's the same thing as like Alpine and HTMX. And then again, if you're using Laravel, there's Livewire. And in Livewire, technically, I think the person who made Livewire also made Alpine. But again, you can use Alpine and HTMX in any language. So if I was working in Go and using plush templates, I could use Alpine and HTMX. If I was working in literally any language, in any templating language, I could sprinkle in some Alpine and HTMX. So for those who need those sort of modern features, there is an innovation for them too. So if you're like, I don't want to learn JavaScript, I like my language and I like my templates, well, you got HTMX and HTMX that can bring some of those modern features to you, so that way you can still have all those benefits of, really nice user experiences. And this is kind of where we are. We have this sort of divide between sort of like this mantra of sort of less JavaScript. And actually, I mean, I would say either way you look at it, the mantra is less JavaScript. The idea is that, we've gone so far with doing everything in JavaScript. This has kind of presented now we're getting to the point where it's starting to hurt our user experiences because JavaScript just takes more to run than HTML. And also it becomes a security issue because there's more security vulnerabilities in JavaScript and search engine issues. But with frameworks on the JavaScript side, you could use frameworks like Next and Nux and Elder.js and SvelteKit, and you can sit there and strip out as much JavaScript as possible before you ship the final website. So you still get to use all those JavaScript tools, but have a lot less JavaScript than what you deliver to the user. And then on the other end, there's people who just don't want to use JavaScript at all, and they can use Alpine and HTMX as sort of an avenue to sort of inject the little JavaScript they need to get the user experience they want, and still continue to heavily sort of lean on the templating language of their choice. So that's kind of where things are at. I mean, again, that whole idea of like swapping out HTML chunks, you have this whole idea of streaming HTML, which is also part of like what React server-side components do, and that's pretty exciting. But I mean, this is sort of like where we're at. Like, okay, how do we maximize? Now it's more like, how do we develop best practices around tools like Next.js? Like, there really isn't sort of like the solid, like, this is the best way to use this thing. What pages should be client-side rendered? Which, this introduces new challenges to the developer, questioning like, when should I use which way within Next? Or, and then for developers who are using a templating language, just really kind of getting acquainted with like Alpine and HTMX and really sort of learning how to incorporate those tools into their lives. But yeah, no, if you've enjoyed this talk, make sure to follow me here on Wisdom. This is the Wisdom app. And I also check me out on YouTube. So go subscribe to me on YouTube. I put out a lot of like tutorial videos, and subscribe to my podcast, Web Dev 101, on all the podcast apps. I constantly like to put out content. I like to talk about interesting things and interesting trends. So hopefully you guys found this enjoyable. Okay, again, give this give me a follow here on Wisdom if you're here on the Wisdom app. And if you're listening to this from elsewhere, join the Wisdom app and give me a follow. Okay, have a great day and enjoy, and thank you for listening.